Red River Valley, Dakota Territory. September 1887. The prairie grass was cured to the color of old brass, and the wind, even in the generous afternoon sun, carried a warning. It was a dry, scouring wind that promised an early and unforgiving winter. On a quarter section of land 2 miles north of the settlement, Aslak Niemelä was building his home, and his neighbors had gathered to watch the construction of a madness. It was not a house. It was not a soddy. It was not a claim shack. It was a cone. A great, absurd cone of wood, and what looked like dirty blankets rising 30 feet from the flattened earth. Quentin Burwell, the settlement's most respected carpenter, stood with his arms crossed, a look of professional pity on his face. He had built a dozen tight, square claim shacks in the valley, each one a testament to right angles and sound Protestant lumber. "It's a tent, Niemelä," Burwell said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "A circus tent. You know the Homestead Act requires a permanent, habitable structure. 12 by 14 with at least one glass window. The land agent comes through in the spring. He'll see this thing, and void your patent. You'll lose the whole section." Caleb Finch, a farmer whose knuckles were permanently swollen from a life of hard work, squinted at the structure. "Where are the walls, man? The wind'll catch the flat of that hide and tear it to ribbons by Christmas." Aslak, a man whose quiet was so profound it seemed a physical part of him, continued his work. He was lashing a thick, tanned hide over a layer of felt near the base of the cone. He didn't turn. He simply said, "The wind will not find a wall." Burwell snorted. "He's mad. Came all the way from Finland or wherever to freeze to death in a teepee." The word hung in the air, a dismissive judgment. To the men of the Red River Valley, who fought the land with axes and plows, this structure was an act of foolish surrender, a flimsy shelter against a landscape that demanded fortresses. The mockery was quiet but constant, a low murmur that followed Aslak from the general store to his own strange plot of land. They called it the Finn's Folly, the canvas cabin, the joke on the prairie. What did this Finnish Sámi coda builder, a man from the forested twilight of Lapland, understand about convective stratification that the finest claim shack carpenters on the prairie, men who lived and breathed the geometry of survival, had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of our ancestors, the practical genius that allowed them to thrive in the harshest conditions on Earth. The story of Aslak Niemelä isn't just about a strange tent. It's about a fundamentally different way of understanding heat, wind, and shelter. I promise that by the end of this video, you will understand the elegant physics that made this cone warmer than any cabin in the Dakota Territory. So subscribe, click the bell, and get ready to learn. And let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a cold so deep it felt like a physical presence, something you could almost touch? Aslak Niemelä was not a carpenter. He had never framed a square wall, pitched a shingled roof, or glazed a window. He was not a farmer, accustomed to the reassuring lines of a plowed furrow. In his homeland, north of the Arctic Circle, he was a coda builder. His hands knew the feel of birch poles, stripped of their bark until they were smooth and pale as bone. They knew the heft of reindeer hide and the dense, oily weight of wool felt, stitched together with sinew. He did not build boxes to live in. He built cones, structures perfected over 1,000 winters, designed to hold a single small fire's worth of life in a world of profound cold. He thought not in terms of walls and roofs, but of skins and skeletons. He had come to America with his wife, Alina, and their 2 small children, Pekka and Anya, drawn by the promise of 160 acres of his own land. They arrived late in the season of 1886, and with their savings nearly gone, bought a hastily constructed claim shack from a family that had given up and fled back east. It was a standard box, pine boards, a single layer of tar paper, a cast iron stove, and 100 gaps for the wind to find. That first winter was a lesson in misery. It became the force that shaped Aslak's resolve. He had known cold his entire life, the deep, still, -40 degrees Fahrenheit cold of the Arctic. But this was different. This was a damp, needling, invasive cold, a cold that was alive with wind. The prairie cold found its way inside the very fabric of their lives. They were never truly warm. Aslak would wake in the night to the sound of Alina's quiet, shivering breaths beside him. The pillows beneath their heads crackled, the linen stiffened by their own frozen exhalations. In the morning, every nail head on the interior walls wore a white crown of frost, a tiny glacier blooming from the iron. When Alina went to the kettle, she would find that the drips from the spout had frozen in place, forming a clear, jagged icicle. They burned through a mountain of wood, the small stove glowing cherry red, yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the iron, consumed by the cold, hungry box. The children were always bundled in coats, their faces chapped, their small hands cold to the touch. One morning, Aslak watched his son Pekka try to play with his wooden soldiers on the floor, only to give up after a few minutes, his fingers too stiff to move them. That was the moment the decision was made. He would not spend another winter in a box. He would build what he knew. The failure of the conventional claim shack was not a failure of materials, but a failure of geometry. It was a prison for cold air. Quentin Burwell and the other builders in the valley understood insulation in its most basic form, stuffing sod, adding paper, sealing cracks. But they did not understand the behavior of air itself. The problem wasn't the cold getting in. The problem was the heat getting out. And the shape of the house was helping it escape. Inside a square cabin, the physics of heat loss worked with brutal efficiency against the inhabitants. The stove, the single source of life, radiated heat. This hot air, being less dense, immediately rose. It traveled straight up to the flat 10-foot ceiling. There, it spread out across a wide, cold surface, immediately beginning to transfer its precious energy to the uninsulated roof boards and the frigid air above. As it cooled, the air became denser. It then sank, but it didn't sink in the middle of the room. It sank along the coldest surfaces, the 4 exterior walls. This created a constant, imperceptible waterfall of cold air pouring down the walls and across the floor. It was a relentless cycle, a self-perpetuating engine of misery. Families like the Crofts and the Finches called it a draft, but it was more than that. It was the house actively circulating cold. To feel warm, you had to be practically sitting on the stove. Move 10 feet away, and you were sitting in a river of cold air flowing back towards the stove to be reheated and begin the cycle anew. The warmest air in the house was always at the ceiling, where no one could feel it. The coldest air was on the floor, where the children played. To combat this, they had to keep their stoves running at maximum capacity, consuming cord after cord of precious cottonwood, the fuel of the prairie. The stovepipe, a direct chimney to the sky, vented not just smoke, but the majority of the heat. A roaring torrent of BTUS shot directly into the uncaring Dakota sky. The box was a machine for being cold. Aslak's construction began in late August. He was not building on the ground, he was building in it. He first dug a circle 30 feet in diameter, sinking the floor of his home 2 feet below the prairie grade. This simple act immediately solved a major problem. The coldest, densest air would now pool harmlessly in this basin, below the level of their sleeping platforms. The earth itself would serve as the first layer of insulation. Next came the skeleton. He used not heavy, squared-off timbers, but 9 slender, debarked birch poles he'd spent weeks preparing. He lashed 3 together to form a primary tripod, the structural core. Then, he laid the other 6 poles into the crux of the tripod, their bases forming the circumference of his sunken circle. The structure was light, almost delicate, yet possessed an immense triangular strength. There were no vertical walls, no 90-degree joints to rack and twist in the wind. Then came the skins. The inner layer was the most crucial. It was made of thick wool felt, purchased at great expense from the store in Pembina. Aslak and Alina spent weeks stitching the massive panels together with heavy sinew, their hands raw. This was the true barrier, the membrane that would hold the warmth. It wasn't airtight, nor was it meant to be. It was breathable, allowing moisture to escape, preventing the buildup of frost and interior ice. The outer layer was a mosaic of tanned cowhides and heavy canvas, treated with linseed oil to make it waterproof. This was the armor, designed to shed wind and snow. The 2 layers were separated by a 6-inch air gap, a crucial design element that created a pocket of dead air, one of the most effective insulators known to man. At the very bottom, the outer skin did not stop at the ground. It extended a full 2 feet outward, creating a wide skirt. Aslak shoveled the earth from his excavation onto this skirt, banking it high. This created an unbreakable seal with the prairie. No wind could get under his home. It was anchored to the Dakota Territory itself. The final piece of the puzzle was the apex. He left an opening at the top, but it was not a simple hole. He constructed a clever 2-tiered cap of hide, like a small roof sitting atop the main cone. It was attached to a long, separate pole that rested on the ground. By moving this pole, he could precisely adjust the opening of this smoke valve, tilting it into or away from the wind, widening or narrowing the gap. Quentin Burwell visited again when the structure was nearly complete. He walked around it, shaking his head. The legal argument was his sharpest tool. "I'm telling you, Niemelä, this is for your own good, he said, his tone that of a man reasoning with a child. "The law is the law. Habitable structure, glass window. You have no window. This is a temporary dwelling. You think the railroad is just giving away land for men to live in tents? They want towns. They want farms. They want permanence. You're jeopardizing your family's future for this notion." Aslak was fitting a small wooden door into a frame he'd built into the cone. He looked up, his blue eyes calm. "My family will be warm," he said. It was the only answer he ever gave. For Aslak, the law of thermodynamics was more immediate and more important than the Homestead Act of 1862. If his family froze, the land patent would be worthless anyway. The genius of Aslak's Lavvu was its elegant embrace of physics. It didn't fight the laws of nature, it used them. The core principle was convective stratification, the same force that made the claim shack so cold, but harnessed here to create a bubble of perpetual warmth. It all started with the fire. Unlike a cabin's iron stove, which is a concentrated point of intense heat, Aslak's fire was a small, open hearth in the very center of the floor. The heat from this fire rose in a gentle, steady column, a plume of warmth and smoke traveling directly upwards. In a square cabin, this column would hit the flat ceiling and spread out, cooling rapidly. But in the cone, the rising air was funneled into an ever-narrowing space. It had nowhere to go but up. As it reached the apex, 30 feet above the floor, the warm air pooled. It couldn't spread out and cool. It was trapped, forming a massive, invisible reservoir of heat, a thermal battery, in the top of the Lavvu. The volume of this heat reservoir was immense. The smoke and hottest gases, being the most buoyant, passed through the very top of the smoke valve and exited, but the vast majority of the merely warm air was trapped. As new warm air rose from the fire, It pushed the slightly cooler air at the edges of the reservoir down along the sloping inner walls of felt. This created a constant, slow, gentle circulation. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The entire interior surface of the cone was constantly being washed with a slow-moving current of warm air. The temperature difference between the floor and the ceiling was minimal. The felt inner wall, warmed by this constant circulation, radiated a gentle heat inward, like a low-temperature oven. The smoke valve was the system's brain. Aslak could tune it with surgical precision. On a calm day, he could open it wide. When the wind blew, he could close it down to a narrow slit, always positioned on the downwind side of the cap. This created a venturi effect, where the wind passing over the top actually helped to pull the smoke out, preventing the interior from ever getting hazy. Crucially, he was venting only the coolest, stalest air from the very top layer, while the massive reservoir of clean, warm air below it remained intact. The sunken floor played its part too. Any cold air that did manage to seep in, or that was introduced when the door opened, was denser than the warm air. It simply flowed to the lowest point and stayed there, trapped in the 2-foot basin below their feet, never interfering with the warm living space above. The entire structure was a finely tuned thermodynamic engine, designed to capture and hold the maximum number of BTUs from the smallest possible fire. A single, small, efficiently burning fire in the Lavvu could create more habitable warmth than a roaring, wood-guzzling stove in a box cabin. The winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, violent assault. In mid-January of 1888, a blizzard, born in the vast emptiness of Alberta, descended upon the plains. It would later be known as an echo of the terrible children's blizzard that had struck just days before in other parts of the territory. For 36 hours, the world simply ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming whiteness. The temperature plummeted to 38 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind, a solid, unstoppable force, blew at a sustained 50 miles per hour, picking up the existing snow and grinding it into a fine, flour-like powder that could penetrate the smallest crack. For the settlers in their claim shacks, it was a battle for survival. The wind hit their flat walls not as a pressure, but as a percussive force, a constant deafening roar punctuated by the shriek of air being forced through window sashes and under doors. The fine snow, like dust, was driven through microscopic gaps in the walls, accumulating in pale drifts on the floorboards. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the wind was stealing the heat as fast as the fire could produce it. The walls were canvases of ice. Inside Aslak Niemelä's cone, there was almost no sound. The aerodynamic shape of the Lavvu gave the wind nothing to purchase. The gale flowed over and around it, as smoothly as water over a river stone. The roaring of the blizzard was reduced to a deep, low hum, the sound of a distant ocean. The banked earth at the base was now buried under a 6-foot drift, sealing the home even more tightly. The central fire was no larger than it usually was, a small circle of quietly burning cottonwood logs. The smoke rose in a perfectly straight, untroubled line to the valve at the apex. The air was still and dry. There was no frost on the inner felt wall. Pekka and Anya slept peacefully on their raised platform, under wool blankets but not in their coats. And in the quiet, steady warmth, Elena performed an act of impossible domesticity. She had a crock of cream, taken from their single cow that morning. In any other dwelling in the valley, that crock would have frozen solid and split like a dropped melon within an hour. Here, near the central pole, it was cool but liquid. Elena took a small wooden paddle and began to churn. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the Lavvu was the soft, rhythmic splash of the paddle. Slowly, the cream thickened. The fat globules began to clump together. By the time the blizzard reached its peak, fury outside, she was scooping a ball of fresh, sweet butter into a wooden bowl. It was more than food. It was proof. It was normalcy in the face of chaos. It was a testament to a home that had not just endured the storm, but had defeated it so completely that the ordinary rhythms of life could continue, uninterrupted. Quentin Burwell was a good man, and a responsible one. He knew the blizzard was no ordinary storm, and he had to check on his livestock. He had a small, sturdy barn, but he feared the snow might drift over its air vents. Bundled so heavily he could barely move, he fought his way from his house to the barn. The wind, a physical wall against him. He carried a shielded lantern, its flame a tiny spark of hope in the maelstrom. He found the animals safe, huddled together, and started the treacherous journey back to the house, a distance of no more than 50 yards. He was halfway there when a gust, stronger than the rest, ripped the lantern from his mittened hand. It tumbled once and was extinguished. He was plunged into an absolute disorienting blindness. The whiteout was so complete he could not see his own feet. The roaring of the wind erased all other sound. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his layers of wool. He did not know which way his house was. He took a few stumbling steps and realized with a surge of terror that he was lost, 50 yards from his own door. He knew what that meant. Men had died this way, wandering in circles until they fell. He stopped, forcing himself to be still, to think. He turned his head slowly, scanning the impenetrable wall of white. And then he saw it. It was faint, almost a ghost, but it was there. A thin, dark, vertical line against the swirling gray. It was a thread of smoke. What was astonishing was its stability. In a 50-mile-per-hour gale, any smoke from a normal chimney would be torn apart, shredded into nothingness, the moment it left the flue. But this smoke thread rose 5, maybe 10 feet, in a nearly perfect column before the wind finally captured and dispersed it. It was coming from Aslak's cone. The Lavvu's shape was creating a slipstream, a pocket of calm air directly above its apex, allowing the smoke to rise unmolested for a few critical feet. It was the only landmark in the entire world. He stumbled toward it, his legs numb, his breath freezing in his beard. He tripped and fell, his body slamming not against a frozen wall, but against a sloping, yielding surface. He had fallen against the base of the Lavvu. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, his gloved hand pressed against the hide. And then he felt it. He expected to feel canvas frozen as hard as iron. He expected a cold that would suck the remaining life from his fingers. Instead, through his thick wool mitten, he felt a deep, steady, impossible warmth. It was not the heat of a fire. It was the warmth of a living thing, like pressing his hand to the flank of a horse on a cold day. The entire structure was radiating heat. He was so stunned he could barely move. This tent, this joke, was warm to the touch from the outside, in the heart of the worst blizzard in 40 years. He pushed himself up and crawled to the door flap, his frozen fingers fumbling to pull it aside. He fell into another world. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. One moment, he was in a universe of deafening, screaming, frozen violence. The next, he was in a world of profound stillness, of gentle warmth and the smell of wood smoke and melting butter. The air was calm. His ears, battered by the wind, rang in the silence. He saw the small fire, the sleeping children, and Alina looking up from her work, her face calm. Aslak rose and helped him to his feet, taking his arm. Burwell's body, rigid with cold, began to shake uncontrollably as the warmth penetrated his clothes. He looked at Aslak, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. He tried to speak, but no words came. He could only stare at the impossible piece of the room. Aslak simply handed him a tin cup of hot coffee. Burwell looked down at the warmth in his hands, then around the inside of the cone that was saving his life. "You didn't build a house," Burwell finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "You built the eye of the storm." When the blizzard finally broke and the sun shone on a world remade in white, the story spread through the valley with the speed of a prairie fire. It was Quentin Burwell himself who told it, over and over, with the fervor of a convert. He described the unwavering smoke thread, the warmth of the outer wall, the butter being churned in the teeth of the gale. He no longer spoke of the Homestead Act. He spoke of genius. Burwell, using his standing in the community, went with Aslak to meet the land agent that spring. He argued passionately that the Lavvu was more of a permanent structure than any of the flimsy shacks that had been blown apart or rendered uninhabitable by the storm. He pointed to the sunken earth foundation, the banked sod. The sheer fact of its survival. The agent, a practical man who had seen the splintered remains of a dozen legal cabins, signed Aslak's patent without objection. The innovation began to spread not as a primary dwelling but in pieces and principles. A traveling Lutheran pastor from Pembina, hearing the story, made a special trip to see the Lavvu. He spent an hour with Aslak, sketching the design of the structure and the smoke valve in his journal. He included the drawings in his next parish letter, a newsletter that circulated among Scandinavian communities across Minnesota and the Dakotas. The most notable adoption came from the community of Finnish immigrants in New York Mills, Minnesota. They were a people who understood the value of heat, and their saunas were central to their lives. They seized upon the pastor's sketch. They began building small, Lavvu-style cones as anterooms for their sauna buildings. It was the perfect design. A transitional space where they could cool down in gentle, draft-free warmth. The breathable felt walls, preventing the damp chill common in other changing rooms. Aslak Niemela's idea, born in the Arctic, had found a new and lasting home on the American frontier. The principles that made Aslak's Lavvu so effective were not magic, they were science. A century later, architects and engineers would give them formal names. The constant, gentle circulation of air is a form of passive heating. The way the wind helped pull smoke from the valve is known as the venturi, or stack effect. The entire structure, with its double wall and earth-sheltered base, is a perfect example of a high-performance thermal envelope. Aslak Niemelä, with no formal training, just the inherited knowledge of his people, had built a perfectly engineered microclimate on the Dakota Prairie, a century ahead of its time. The story of the American frontier is often told as a story of conflict, of man battling nature. The settlers in the Red River Valley saw the winter as an enemy, and they built fortresses to fight it. They built with heavy timbers, thick sod, and brute force. But a fortress presents a flat wall to the enemy, a surface for the wind to push against, a barrier for the cold to breach. Their struggle was one of constant, exhausting resistance. Aslak Niemelä did something different. He did not see the wind as an enemy to be blocked, but as a force to be navigated. He understood that the greatest strength was not in rigidity, but in shape. His home did not stand against the prairie winter. It yielded to it, guiding its force, shedding its fury, and using its own laws to create an island of unshakable calm. He didn't fight the wind with weight. He gave it a shape it could not catch. In a land that rewarded stubbornness, his victory was one of elegance. He proved that sometimes the deepest wisdom lies not in how hard you fight, but in how well you understand the currents you are swimming in. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We want to know what you think. What other examples of old world knowledge have proven superior to modern assumptions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The events, characters, and names presented are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to build a historical structure or apply these principles today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, standards, and safety regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.